Professor Cristian Cantir, thank you very much for joining our interview series. Let me start right away with the first question. How would you characterize the broader significance of Moldova's 2025 parliamentary elections, particularly in light of the pro-European Action and Solidarity Party's ability to withstand unprecedented Russian interference campaigns? To what extent can this outcome be read as a genuine consolidation of Moldova's democratic resilience, and to what degree is it contingent upon extraordinary external support from the EU and its allies?
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you, and always happy to talk about Moldova. It's a topic that doesn't get a lot of attention in international affairs, so very happy to be here. Well, first of all, I think just as at a macro level, as a general point, I think it's a major win for the European Union and a major defeat for the Kremlin. I think it's okay to frame it in this way, just on when it comes to giving a general framework for understanding what happened. To the extent that it was generally a free and fair elections, according to most international observers, despite massive Russian interference operations, and was consistent with Moldova's tradition of holding generally free and fair elections since independence. I would say it's a good sign of the relative health of Moldovan democracy. The election was run competently, with electoral authorities and law enforcement responding pretty promptly to potential challenges, including things like bomb threats and cases of various cases of violations, electoral corruption, and so on. So from that standpoint, yes, it is a pretty good example, I think, of I don't know if I would use the word consolidation, but I would say confirmation of Moldova's democratic resilience. There are still a lot of problems with Moldova's democratic consolidation that we can talk about, but certainly good news for Moldova's democracy. I do think the election results could be in part attributed to external EU support, but I think it's important to refine this point a little bit and point to one particular individual, and that is Moldovan President Maia Sandu. Sandu is a quite unique politician, I think, in Moldovan political history, but also in Central and Eastern Europe. She's been a very popular kind of anti-corruption, reformist candidate, pro-European candidate. A lot of criticisms of her or attacks on her by the pro-Russian opposition haven't really stuck. She has remained extremely popular in Moldova, in the Moldovan political landscape, in part because of her high status abroad, particularly among EU politicians. So in that respect, if we talk about kind of external influence, I think it's a mix of the two. I think it's Maia Sandu's popularity and the European Union's admiration for her and support of her during this particular campaign. I wouldn't be as confident in saying that the ruling party can be given an immense amount of credit for winning the election. There are still some fundamental issues with PAS, the ruling party in Moldova, as a pro-EU force that we can elaborate on as well.
Right. Do the results primarily reflect a deepening consolidation of Moldova's pro-European trajectory, or are they better understood as a rejection of entrenched pro-Russian elites such as Igor Dodon and his allies? In other words, should we interpret the outcome as an ideological commitment to Europe or as an electoral repudiation discredited of political actors?
I think we could start by saying that EU integration is genuinely popular with a majority of the Moldovan population. Most polls show that to be the case, and even the 2024 referendum, even though the margin was razor thin, indicates popularity. And we can talk about the fact that the razor thin margins could have been attributed, at least in part, to vote buying allegations and to the pro-Russian opposition kind of framing it as a referendum on PAS, on the ruling party, rather than on the EU specifically. Since PAS has effectively been associated as the pro-EU party, and since this image has eroded the viability of any other pro-EU force, most pro-EU Moldovans, I think, voted for the ruling party. however frustrated they might have been with the party's slow response to some major challenges like poverty or judicial reform. So yeah, to some extent, I think it's a reflection of Moldovans supporting EU integration and not seeing any other alternatives to PAS in this respect. A lot of that vote, though, was strategic. It doesn't indicate necessarily happiness with PAS itself as a party or with its performance. It's just that there were no real other alternatives. The other parties running in the elections also, I think, can be blamed for struggling to fashion a narrative that is an alternative to what PAS was saying. Many of them suggested that they do support some degree of EU integration. Even pro-Russian parties said that they would negotiate more with the European Union. They tried to incorporate or inject some messages about sovereignty. They tried to bring in socially conservative messaging that kind of targeted the social liberalism of the European Union. This hasn't really resonated with a lot of Moldovans because really it was kind of perceived as this messaging of we will pump the brakes on European Union integration, but with no real explanation of what exactly that entails or why that would have to happen. And a lot of the policies that they were arguing for really didn't resonate as much as like visa-free travel, like lower roaming fees, which is what like day-to-day kind of concerns that Moldovans have with EU integration. So the alternative was just not clear. The alternative was mostly we promise to not be the current political elites. So yeah, I think they could. The results could be attributed to the continuing popularity in the EU, to the somewhat poor quality of opposition leaders, because they were more united by resentment of the ruling party and attempts to purge the system or what they call the regime, rather than being more proactive or more positive in their electoral offers.
Right. The Moldovan diaspora appears to have played a decisive role in shaping the electoral outcome. How should we understand the implications of this phenomenon for the transnationalization of Moldovan democracy, particularly regarding questions of sovereignty, external leverage, and the construction of a political community that extends well beyond national borders?
The question about the Moldovan diaspora is really interesting because the diaspora has been kind of essential in helping and consolidating Moldova's pro-EU course, especially in the last few years. It's also become much more easy to vote if you're a diaspora member in Western countries in particular, and it's really where the diaspora votes. As a result, the Moldovan diaspora is very pro-Western in its orientation. Overwhelmingly so, really, if you look at the last few elections. With some exceptions, the Moldovan diaspora is really recent. So really the first wave of the diaspora started in the 1990s. So attachments to the homeland are still really strong and connections remain strong. Travel is also much easier. Low-cost airlines, I think, would be a good example in this regard. And because most Moldovans are now legally abroad, there's much less fear than in the 90s and the 2000s when there was quite a bit of travel that was not technically legal, right? People just kind of immigrated illegally or crossed borders without a visa or whatever, and were afraid to come back to Moldova. So so the connections are still really strong because of that. The diaspora hasn't really developed a separate identity yet. They're still very much kind of rooted in Moldova. Just to give you an example, if you're in Moldova in August, it's quite something because you hear Moldovan kids with like Portuguese accents in stores, and dentist offices are really hard to get into because everybody's getting like dentistry done. So the diaspora is very much part of the fabric of Moldovan society, and the ruling PAS, similar to other parties, has been very friendly and encouraging toward the diaspora. There are events that are exclusively for the diaspora, lots of success stories being covered in the media, lots of programs for the diaspora to come back home, share its experiences, lots of gratitude for remittances, which have contributed to kind of offsetting some of the I guess more severe socioeconomic inequalities in the country. It's also important to keep in mind that Moldovans, the attachment that they have for sovereignty, as we conventionally think about it, has always had a transnational dimension to it. Many people have looked to Romania for cultural and ethnic identity markers, or have looked to Russia. So Moldovans are like a little more accustomed to like hybrid and multiple identities. They're therefore able to be extremely connected both to the countries where they live at the moment and to Moldovan politics in general, facilitated, of course, by technology, Facebook, the ability to kind of read the news or watch the news live. Where the diaspora becomes a little more complicated is in it being politicized, particularly by pro-Russian forces. Because the diaspora is so supportive of pro-Western groups, pro-Russian politicians have been pushing a narrative, especially visible, I would say, in the last few years, that Moldovans inside the country don't like PAS, while those abroad do. So there's really a claim that they're keeping Moldovans hostage to the PAS regime. So pro-Russian groups are trying to fan tensions between these two groups. And Igor Dodon, the Moldova's most popular politician, has even used the term parallel electorate to define the diaspora. And another pro-Russian politician, Irina Vlach, has been on this kind of odd warpath, trying out narratives, including like asking Moldovans to quote unquote adopt a Moldovan inside the country who's suffering from the pro-EU PAS. I wouldn't be surprised if these narratives continue to be pushed, and if they end up really working in the sense that they do fan some differences or some tensions that we see between the diaspora and people who are still in Moldova. Furthermore, and one more point about the diaspora, I think it's important to remember that Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its interference in Moldovan politics has put a pin in one major question about the Moldovan diaspora, and that has to do with the Moldovan diaspora that lives in Russia. There are different estimates of how many people from or of Moldovan origin live in Russia, from like close to 100,000 to a few 100,000. But in any case, because of Russia's interference, Moldovan authorities have only opened a minimal number of polling stations where they can vote, and most of them have been in Moscow. Russia, of course, is an immense country. This means that it's a little bit more difficult for Moldovan voters to cast ballots. They've done so legitimately because they can't ensure ballot security in Russia proper in light of Russia's interference. But this doesn't solve the problem of what exactly one can do about the Moldovan diaspora. How are we going to facilitate the equal vote of every single member of the diaspora, and how does every member of the diaspora get treated in terms of like the polling stations that are opened and so on. So it's a big question that I think Moldovan politicians will have to answer, and it's been muted by Russian interference.
Right. With voter turnout just above 50%, what does the relative disengagement of a significant portion of the electorate reveal about the legitimacy and durability of PAS mandate? To what extent does persistent electoral apathy constrain the prospects for long-term democratic consolidation and weaken the societal foundations of Moldova's pro-European orientation?
So I want to make a kind of a statistical note. First, the 2024 Moldovan census identified about 2.3, 2.4 million Moldovans in the country with kind of a stable residency. The electoral rolls from the Central Electoral Commission basically identify like close to 300,000 Moldovans abroad, which doesn't quite work. There are many more Moldovans that still have Moldovan residency but work abroad or live abroad. So turnout is a little more difficult to assess in Moldova in light of this kind of fragmented data that we have. But the general premise to the question still works, because the percentage does reflect a degree of disengagement. I think it poses a problem to PAS and to Moldova's pro-European orientation, in the sense that people who are disengaged or don't see a stake in Moldova's pro-EU orientation, or don't see the benefits of EU integration, would fall much more easily to populist messaging. And in Moldova, populist messaging carries a much more Eurosceptic and much more pro-Russian kind of dimension to it. And as a result, people might be more vulnerable to being mobilized by these populist politicians, which subsequently then gives them more institutional power to undermine EU integration. So I think PAS's ability to display the benefits of EU integration to these more apathetic groups should be an important part of their strategy, because otherwise we might see more popularity being more visible popularity for populist politicians. We saw a few of them emerge. Happy to elaborate on those. It's really two politicians that have become more visible, but certainly the risks are there for more popularity.
Right. Observers have described Moldova as a laboratory for Russia's hybrid interference strategies. In your assessment, what does 2025 electoral cycle reveal about both the adaptive capacities and structural limitations of Moscow's toolkit of influence? Can we speak of a paradigmatic shift in Kremlin's approach, or are we witnessing the persistence of familiar strategies with diminishing returns?
That's a really good question, and I think the easiest answer is that we don't know yet, and there's a reason why that is the case. So the 2025 election was characterized by more intensity and more diversity in the Kremlin's attempts at interference. So they invested more money, they invested in more political actors, they were more involved in trying to stoke violence or protests. None of that was particularly effective. And there are a couple of things to keep in mind here. First of all, Moldovan law enforcement and general institutional response has been more active in the sense that they dealt more effectively, even compared to 2024, with egregious examples of electoral interference. This includes vote buying, the use of cryptocurrency to transfer money, even the use of just cash, illegal financing, things like that. Another major trend that I think helps us kind of understand the Kremlin's issues or problems with its approach toward Moldova is that for a very long time, Russia got accustomed to acting with relative impunity in Moldova. So even when pro-European forces were in power, or pro-European plus centrist forces were in power, Moldovan institutions and politicians weren't particularly proactive in curbing Russian influence. So at best, they would ignore Russia's attempts, and at worst, pro-Russian politicians would simply bolster Russian influence in the country. I think Moscow is a bit taken aback by the extent to which Moldovan institutions have responded in such a consistent way to Russian interference. So I don't know if we're going to witness a shift in the Kremlin's approach, but I think there's certainly more reevaluation and more discussion about what the Kremlin can do to adjust its strategies. There's one more point that I want to make here, and that has to do with the fact that the Kremlin they know a lot about Moldova, more so than many people in the West. The problem, though, is that they keep getting fed information by primarily pro-Russian politicians that are that are pushing these narratives that are often simply like inaccurate, right? So, for example, this argument by some pro-Russian groups that European Union integration is not popular in the country. Some of that stuff is just not true, and it's hard to figure out if the Kremlin and pro-Russian groups are kind of falling victim to their own narratives that limit their understanding of Moldovan dynamics and therefore make these strategies ineffective. But it's certainly something that I've often thought about, because some of the claims that you see in Russian propaganda are just like laughable and rudimentary. So you wonder whether they actually genuinely believe that, because it doesn't even work as propaganda. That's how rudimentary it is. So, yep.
All right. In the light of your previous work on Moldova's foreign policy balancing, how would you assess Chisinau's current capacity to resist Moscow's strategies of destabilization, particularly given Russia's reliance on authoritarian style tactics such as elite capture, patronage networks, and the exploitation of populist narratives?
I think when it comes to balancing, we've seen a bit of a shift in the perception of the EU as a counterbalance to Russia, which was really kind of more prominent among more pro-Russian or centrist groups. There's the idea that Moldova should extract benefits from all of its major kind of geopolitical allies. And so we've seen a shift from that to a more cultural or identity-based argument. So you see the ruling pro-European group make the identity-based claim that Moldova is European and belongs in Europe. You see a lot of rhetoric that says Moldova needs to go home and be part of Europe. So I'm seeing less articulation of the EU as a tool for Moldova's pursuit of strategic goals and more articulation of the EU as a natural place, as a place of belonging for Moldovans. Pro-Russian pro-Russian parties are continuing to make this balancing case, but that has been undermined by the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. They haven't really reevaluated or refashioned their rhetoric on Russia after that, but the world is just different after 2022. So this balancing argument doesn't quite have the same cachet as it did before. It's still relatively popular in polling, actually, if you look at some polling data, but again, not as compelling from a political standpoint. With respect to its elite capture, the Kremlin started to kind of learn or understand that Moldovan institutions are responding more coherently to Russian threats. So some of its old patronage networks or elite capture strategies are not working as effectively because Moldovan law enforcement is pushing back. And one example of this would be Russia's attempt to infiltrate Moldovan politicians or encourage spying or whatever. The Moldovan Secret Service has been more proactive in responding to that. So I'm not sure how the Kremlin is going to deal with this particular problem. But the Kremlin still has a lot of power when it comes to the populist narratives that I mentioned and the vulnerabilities that can create in light of Moldova's socioeconomic issues, including high rates of poverty. Any sort of vulnerability can be exploited by populist politicians and consequently by pro-Kremlin groups as well.
Right. What does the Moldovan case tell us about Russia's evolving approach to influence operations in the post-Soviet space, especially compared to its tactics in Ukraine and Georgia?
I think one of the differences between Ukraine and Georgia is that where Russia doesn't have the ability or the kind of the immediate interest to engage in military action, unlike what it did in Ukraine, it's doing in Ukraine, unlike what it did in Georgia. What this suggests is that its influence operations are less effective in the face of effective institutional response, and in the face of consistent support from other Moldovan allies. So because direct military threats are not immediate, Moldova can operate in a way that gives it more opportunities to fight a Russian influence. And we see this when it comes to some Moldovan politicians talking about Odessa. Odessa is a kind of a looming presence in Moldovan politics, because if Odessa falls, then the calculus changes significantly. If Odessa doesn't fall, and if Ukraine fights off the invading Russian army in the south of Ukraine and in Odessa specifically, I think it's going to be a little easier for Moldova to fight influence operations without this kind of looming direct threat of military intervention.
Right. How sustainable is Moldova's reliance on Western partners for countering hybrid threats, given the country's domestic vulnerabilities such as corruption, weak institutions, and economic hardship?
I think that's a good point, because yes, ideally, what you would want is a sovereign state to have strong institutions, fewer socioeconomic problems, a pretty consistent fight against corruption, and that would give it enough capacity to be able to fight off things like Russian influence fairly effectively without a significant amount of support. I do think the European Union needs to focus on those factors as well, right? So on dealing with corruption, on dealing with institutions, dealing with economic hardship. But I do think that Moldova's reliance on Western partners to fight Russian hybrid warfare is necessary in the sense that this is not only Moldova's problem, right? So to the extent that this is a transnational problem, a transnational response is necessary and required, and it has to be coordinated. So Moldova can't handle this alone and shouldn't handle it alone. So a long-term kind of institutionalized cooperation with the EU is needed in this regard, both because it is an inherently international problem. Russian hybrid attacks, I think, extend beyond Moldova, and because Moldova's capacities are fairly reduced. But even if Moldova was a consistently strong, like if it had good governance and if it had strong institutions, it would still need to work quite closely with the European Union to deal with this particular threat.
Right. How realistic is Moldova's aim to achieve EU accession by 2030, given both the demanding structural reforms and potential geopolitical vetoes within the EU, and in what ways might deep internal polarization between pro-European and pro-Russian constituencies undermine the legitimacy of this process by opening space for populist mobilization and authoritarian retrenchment?
I do think that internal geopolitical polarization is a big problem in Moldova, but one thing to remember is that polarization is a fluid phenomenon. So in that respect, I think it's key to keep in mind that polling used to show a lot more support for integration with Russian projects, for example, like even 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, or much less support for even for like NATO membership, for instance. So polarization can increase or decrease. The plan by Moldovan authorities is to make a compelling economic argument or kind of quality of life argument first, even in areas where the political dimension of EU integration isn't as popular. So this is their strategy in regions like Gagauzia. This is their strategy in some parts of the Moldovan north, is to erode polarization by demonstrating the benefits of the economic benefits, in particular, of EU integration. If that succeeds, that can offset some of the consequences of geopolitical polarization by reducing these tensions. So I think the biggest question isn't really polarization, but whether pro-EU forces can articulate and illustrate the benefits of EU integration clearly to more people, including to those that are in some of these pro-Russian propaganda bubbles. And to a large extent, I think integration by 2030 is driven more by the speed with which Moldovan authorities can enact reforms, by the developments in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also Transnistria, which we can talk about, and what exactly Moldovan authorities are going to do with that separatist region.
Right. Given the persistence of Russian troops in Transnistria, how does the unresolved status of the region constrain Moldova's European ambitions and sovereignty more broadly?
So I think the amount of Russian troops in Transnistria isn't sufficient to threaten Moldova's European ambitions or its sovereignty. There are actually more risks with, let's say, a hypothetical mobilization of a lot of the Transnistrian population during a potential conflict, but there are more difficulties there that we can discuss as well. Nor does the amount of Russian troops present a risk to sovereignty, in the sense that Moldova is able to actually control most of its territory fairly effectively other than Transnistria. So in that sense, it's not an immediate threat. And in addition, I think the war in Ukraine has constrained Transnistria's perhaps aggressive orientation or even foreign policy toward Ukraine, toward Moldova, or the European Union in general. There's a sense in Moldova that European Union integration must move forward and can happen without Transnistria. So Moldovan authorities have actually said that it is possible that Moldova could join the European Union without Transnistria first, using the Cyprus model. So Cyprus is a fairly common kind of example that Moldovan authorities have used. And it's amplified by even former EU officials. I think Jose Manuel Barroso recently made a statement that to that effect, where he said that the Cyprus model is certainly a possibility for Moldova to join. So at this point, Chisinau is not treating Transnistria as an impediment to European Union integration. It's arguing that pre-integration approaches to demonstrating the economic benefits of EU integration will bring Transnistria more and more into the fold. If necessary, Moldova can join the EU without Transnistria, and then it can work on integrating Transnistria into the European Union in the long term.
Right. And lastly, Professor Cantir, what scenarios do you consider most plausible for the future of Transnistria conflict? Gradual reintegration under the EU auspices, continued limbo, or renewed escalation tied to Russia's strategic setbacks in Ukraine? And in any of the scenarios, how might populist or authoritarian actors instrumentalize the issue domestically to challenge Moldova's European orientation?
I think the most important thing to note here is that, is kind of the elephant in the room, which is that all of it depends on how Russia's invasion of Ukraine goes. If Ukraine manages to resist in the south, if it manages to hold Odessa, then what we are most likely going to see, at least in the short term, is a maintenance of the status quo, with efforts by the European Union to continue to trade and develop and engage with local organizations in Transnistria, basically try to connect Transnistria to Europe more with the long-term plan of gradual reintegration. So I think that will be the general orientation, or at least attempt. Again, keeping in mind developments in Ukraine and Odessa in particular. When it comes to the question about populist or authoritarian actors instrumentalizing the issue, one of the biggest patterns to watch for, and I would say like in the next few years in Moldova, is how actors articulate the aforementioned argument about the Cyprus model. PAS has argued that Moldova can join the EU without Transnistria first. A lot of other actors, and this includes pro-Russian politicians in the Patriotic Bloc, the biggest opposition group in parliament, as well as Alternativa, this kind of centrist, self-defined pro-EU bloc, they have argued that Moldova must not enter the European Union without Transnistria, which means that they're effectively giving Transnistria and Moscow, to some extent, veto power over Moldova's EU integration aspirations. So populist politicians will try, and authoritarian actors in Moldova will try to instrumentalize the Transnistria question by saying that Moldova must not and cannot join the European Union without resolving the Transnistrian conflict first, which of course increases the timeline significantly and tethers a lot of the European integration to Moscow's willingness to resolve the conflict.
Okay, Professor Cantir, thank you so very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you.